news, everyone. Trump has ended another social media post by proclaiming, "Give me liberty or give me death." Deal. On the other hand, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who may turn out to be the spoiler who throws the election to Trump, says under oath that his cognitive problems and short-term and longer-term memory loss come from a worm that ate his brain and then died. On the other hand, too early to tell if it's an outlier or the start of the new wave, but swing state poll, Wisconsin, Quinnipiac, registered voters, Biden 50, Trump 44. The three-way, Biden 40, Trump 39, Kennedy and his worm 12. Nevertheless, I am not confident we can stave off fascism in this country because worms in Kennedy's brain. And also, Trump's trial in Florida has been delayed until the 12th of never by an unqualified judge that he appointed, and now his trial in Georgia has been delayed indefinitely, probably into next year, because the appeals court there says it will listen to Trump's appeal of the ruling that the district attorney did not have a financial conflict of interest just because she hired her boyfriend to work on the case, because guess what? There is a deep state, and among its constituent parts are the entirety of the legal system and partisan judges and the Supreme Court and a serving attorney general who will go to his grave believing that the people exist to serve the laws rather than the laws existing to serve the people. Also, because Obama's most public advisor criticized all the naughty talk in the Stormy Daniels testimony and, oh, by the way, worms in RFK Jr.'s brain. Memory loss, quote, caused by a worm that got into my brain and ate a portion of it and then died. I have cognitive problems, clearly. I have short-term memory loss, and I have longer-term memory loss that affects me. RFK Jr. in a deposition during his divorce in 2012 in a bid to pay less alimony. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told me I was his hero, I knew something was wrong. Kennedy told the New York Times that he has recovered from brain fog and memory loss, and there were no further problems from the worm that ate his brain. Of course, if you're like me, you may be wondering, if he said he had short-term memory loss because of the worm and longer-term memory loss because of the worm, you wonder if the odds aren't really good that he just forgot about those problems caused by the worm that ate his brain and then died. Actually, says an expert on parasites interviewed by the Times, once that worm moves in, it's staying. You're going to basically have almost like a tumor that's there forever, says Scott Gardner from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. It's not going to go anywhere. The cells calcify around the dead worm. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s brain has been partially eaten by a parasite, which died, and then his brain created a little crypt for it, like Grant's tomb. Hey, who's buried in RFK Jr.'s brain's tomb? Or RFK Jr.'s clear mental instability and his amazing adherence to conspiracy theories is not caused by his little friend Wormy, who's always with him. When the Times spoke to Kennedy, Kennedy said he had trouble retrieving words, and he had, quote, severe brain fog from, for a long time, having eaten almost nothing but mercury-laden fish, like perch and tuna, quote, I love tuna fish sandwiches. I hate them all the time. Kennedy said he had his blood tested, and the mercury was 10 times the levels the EPA considers safe. Another expert says that another brain problem Kennedy has is far more likely to make him act like he acts. He's been hospitalized at least 4 times for atrial fibrillation. He said as recently as 2012, doctors used a defibrillator to reset his heart rhythm because when it gets bad, quoting RFK Jr. again, it feels like there's a bag of worms in my chest. This seems to be a theme. bag of worms in his chest, dead worm in his brain. And he's positioned himself as the young, healthy candidate. Life's a lot like that. I hope the worms like tuna. The good news here is Kennedy's running mate, Nicole, somebody who married money, she has nothing to worry about here. No pain, no gain, but no brain, no worms. So, like the dog in the hat in the room that's on fire says, this is fine. The Trump trial resumes, and you no longer have to explain which one because the hush money election interference one in New York is the only one now. Trump begins the day under another threat of contempt of court for something we didn't hear about until long after court adjourned Tuesday, that he was audibly cursing during the Daniels testimony. Justice Juan Merchan handled it during a sidebar so as to not embarrass Trump, and I have really bad news for the justice and anybody else who tries Trump now or next year or in the distant future. You're going to have to embarrass him at some point. You cannot expect him to keep doing it all by himself. Judge, call him out on this. This is the trial. You are the judge. You are the last guardrail. If he does this again, tell him one more word out of you and I'm finding you in contempt and sending you to Rikers. And no, by the way, although they'll probably give it to him, he does not automatically get Secret Service protection in jail. The statute, revised in 2013, merely says an ex-president can be given lifetime Secret Service protection. There isn't even that much clarity about an active presidential candidate who goes to jail. Still, he probably will get it because even I would say if Trump gets sent to jail for contempt of court in this case and somebody shivs him, it's going to look bad. I mean, the whole question of feeding Trump in a New York City detention facility is going to be trouble enough. Trump does not have a Kennedy dead bug in his brain, but with that diet of his, I would not bet against him having a bunch of tapeworms. Justice Merchan may also have yet another gag order violation to contend with. The order is explicit. Trump can't trash the witnesses, and he can't instruct anybody else to trash them on his behalf. But parking lot law genius Alina Habba went on Fox late Tuesday night and insisted some of the testimony Tuesday, quote, was frankly false. And that would be accusing the witnesses of perjury. And Merchan could easily jail Trump for that, though again, he probably won't because the area is murky and he might have to prove Trump ordered Habba to say something stupid, which would be really tough, considering that Habba says something stupid pretty much all the time of her own volition anyway. I can fake being smart. Two more Trump trial notes to come, but I want to circle back to two entities that think they understand that the nation is imperiled, but appear to assume that the worst possible outcome is some sort of downturn in market futures. These entities are the New York Times and David Axelrod. David Axelrod first. I'll just read his post. I'm not a lawyer, but were all those cringeworthy Stormy details necessary or even advisable? I'm assuming Axelrod means the sex, the details of which were in fact minimal. A condom? Not a condom. Not a condom. Oh, look out, David Axelrod just fainted. Nearly all of her testimony, resuming today, was about the payoffs and the non-disclosure agreements and the threats and her fears and her interviews. And for all we know, maybe that's what Axelrod meant because he posted his tut-tutting a mere 16 hours after Stormy Daniels ended her first day of testimony, and I didn't go through his whole feed, but it does not look like David Axelrod reads or responds to any replies. So his cryptic, useless, unhelpful sentence there will remain indecipherable as Trump's trial and the Daniels cross-examination resume. However, David Axelrod is not indecipherable. He is, to quote a sage, a prick. The The last we heard from him was in February when he was still helping the Republican age plot against Biden, still helping Trump against democracy, telling reporters that while Trump was a gaffe machine, quote, because he is energetic, these questions are not as profound for him. But that when Biden snapped at a CNN question about his age, it showed he was old. And addressing him, Axelrod said, it's the opinion of a lot of Americans who only see you in front of a camera. They don't see you in the Situation Room. They don't see you in these closed-door meetings. Dave, that's probably because the doors are closed. I'm just guessing. Axelrod started this shit last fall. He was one of the people who began to help the Trump campaign and the Republicans build up the now almost forgotten after the State of the Union age plot, which went away, at least according to polling, among everybody but Trump diehards. Axelrod complained Biden was not doing enough interviews. Then, as the February quote I just read suggested, he complained Biden was doing too many interviews. In November, 1 year before the election, Axelrod said Biden needed to get out or get going, whatever the hell that means, like Stormy Details or Stormy Petrels or whatever he wrote yesterday. He didn't explain that line either. And then Biden called him a prick. And Jonathan Martin of Politico wrote a series of stories about this, ending with his campaign advice that, quote, if Biden thinks the country is on the line, he should act like it. And calling David Axelrod a prick is not a strategy to win 270 electoral votes. And you read that bit of wisdom and you think, has Jonathan Martin been hanging around with RFK Jr.'s brainworm? No, RFK Jr.'s brainworm is going to be hired by CNN. Okay, I amend my earlier comments. David Axelrod is not necessarily a prick, but it is clear now he is a one-hit wonder. As a political consultant, his list of clients included Obama, Hillary, John Edwards, Chris Dodd, and that was just for the 2008 campaign. He finally settled on Obama. He had one great idea. Turn Obama's comparative inexperience from a bug into a feature and call it change. And make it a catchphrase with nice, pretty posters. And he's been coasting on it ever since. Our CNN panel tonight, RFK Jr.'s brainworm and David Axelrod. Back to the New York Times, and I'm not going to rehash the entire self-immolation by the paper of record, which should amend its antediluvian motto to all the news that's fit to print provided you give us an exclusive. Just to remind you that first, a Times reporter I actually know named Talman Smith tweeted on February 7th, quote, liberals only primarily blaming the media. When was the last time Biden did an open presser or did an on-record Q&A with us? Right. Thank you. We're not his PR people. It was a shocking revelation inside the Times mindset that this is not about preserving democracy or just being a newspaper. It's about whether or not the president does a Q&A with the New York Times. Then last month, the former Obama staffer Dan Pfeiffer criticized the Times on the whole save democracy thing. And then Sunday, Times editor-in-chief Joe Kahn answered Pfeiffer at Semaphore News, turned his plea on behalf of, not having a dictatorship, and dismissed it as some kind of demand by the Biden side that the Times become, quote, an instrument of the Biden campaign. Kahn made the rather terrifying assertion that, quote, it's our job to cover the full range of issues that people have. At the moment, democracy is one of them, but it's not the top one. Immigration happens to be the top, and the economy and inflation is the second. Should we stop covering those things because they're favorable to Trump and minimize them? The more I have thought about that part of the Marie Antoinette-ish answer from the Times editor-in-chief, the more I have thought they should have fired Joe Kahn on the spot, and not even primarily because Joe Kahn seems to be unaware that his paper and all papers and all the freedom of the press and all of American democracy and his personal freedom are at stake in this election, and instead he's being a snotty schoolboy about it. but rather he should be fired because that one answer he gave happens to reek of a really, really bad reporter or editor or copy boy. Nobody said don't cover all issues. Nobody said become an instrument of the Biden campaign. All you were critiqued about was your utter inability to get over yourself. The President of the United States does not have to give you an interview or give one to the Post or the Wall Street Journal. It's not a test of his fitness. And you should not be permitted to revenge yourself against him because he didn't do the interview. Your belief that you count in that way, like the goddamn Times, is its own Supreme Court, God help us. That's a test of your fitness, not his. And you failed that test. Mr. Pfeiffer, whose comments escalated this, has now written in a similar vein to what I just said. He reminds Mr. Khan that he did not ask the Times to become propaganda, just to worry more about the stakes than the horse race, and to, quote, specifically call out the threat that is a second Trump presidency. In general, he writes, and this is a complaint I have had about the New York Times that is 2 decades old, I wish they would take good faith criticism from the left with as much seriousness as they take bad faith criticism from the right, unquote. Exactly. The Times response? Not yet. Upper left-hand corner of the website yesterday, Green moves to oust Johnson. And House Republicans clash with public school leaders over anti-Semitism claims. Upper right-hand corner of the Times website yesterday. Why are we obsessed with breasts? Hey, now there's a segue back to Trump. 2 postscripts in this segue about social media posts. Trump complained that Tuesday's testimony did not include any kind of smoking gun. Only he spelled it smocking, S-M-O-C-K-I-N-G, smocking gun. Are we sure about him and worms? And then the first post in I don't know how long about which I am conflicted. At 10:57 p.m. Tuesday night, quote, I spotted ratings-challenged Lawrence O'Donnell of MSDNC in the courthouse today. I haven't seen him in years. He looks like shit, a real loser. Firstly, O'Donnell looks like shit? Look, this is urgent. Rumors of a Trump financial crisis must be true. Therefore, we must buy Donald Trump a mirror. Then, the other side of the story. This next part was submitted by a friend who, like me, once worked with and got worked over by Lawrence O'Donnell, who, when Joe Scarborough is finally incarcerated, will be the least sincere person on that network. The author is anonymous, but he has written it as Lawrence O'Donnell, who I can assure you has only ever been anonymous when he's called conservatives to leak stuff to them to undercut his colleagues at MSNBC. The impression of his voice is, I would say, mediocre, but unavoidable under the circumstances. Not every former chief of staff for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, the most powerful legislative committee in history, turned Emmy-nominated writer-performer on Aaron Sorkin's landmark series, The West Wing, turned cable news guest in the medium's nascent stages, turned commander of the 10 p.m. Eastern time slot, is immediately recognizable by former presidents of the United States, but I happen to be. Which reminds me of the time I found myself playing miniature golf on Martha's Vineyard with former RNC chairman Haley Barbour, former Ronald Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan, longtime Kennedy confidant Pierre Salinger, and the fifth of Charlie's Angels, Shelley Hack. When up to the first tee at this particular Martha's Vineyard mini golf course stepped Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah and his companion Loretta Swit, Hot Lips Houlihan, on the CBS television version of MASH, M star, A star, S star, H. Thank you, my anonymous friend. You left out that before he played mini golf, Lawrence was no doubt just back from dinner with an actress who was half of half his age. Also of interest here, not yet finished with Lawrence O'Donnell. Plus, you can make jokes about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s brainworm. I mean, he brought it up under oath as an excuse for why he didn't have to pay so much alimony. So it is fair game. But you know what? You, congressman over there, you probably shouldn't make a joke in which you link it to his father's assassination or his uncle the president's assassination. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown. Well, Trump brought him up, and then I brought him up, and then my anonymous friend brought him up, so why not? Let me tell you about the day Lawrence O'Donnell was eating lunch on the sidewalk right outside my apartment building, and he suddenly admitted that he and the others crashed MSNBC, and I almost forgave him for trying to steal Countdown from me while I was on leave taking care of my dying father. But I didn't. Things I promised not to tell ahead, and it includes another Aaron Sorkin story. But first, as ever, there are still more new idiots to talk about. The daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, worser, some guy named Jim Kortovich. Jim Kortovich is identified by the New York Times as the high-flying lobbyist spin doctor for the Saudis, Qataris, etc. And he's apparently mentioned in a new book called The Wolves of K Street, which is about lobbyists, especially Republicans like this guy, Kortovich, or whatever his name is. The authors reported that a client was suing this man, and they excerpted that part of their book in Politico, and they added this, quote, "Before our book went to press, we reached out to Kortovich for comment. He responded by text and email with the swagger he's become known for. Quote, I'm coming after you full guns, and that's why I live where I do and why you live where you do. We are going to the mattress, and like everything in my life, I will win." It's mattresses. We are going to the mattresses, not we are going to the mattress. Famous line from The Godfather about the mafia families going to all-out war is, we go to the mattresses, as in we'll have to have so many people fighting. We have to get a secret location to house them all, and we'll have to find dozens of new mattresses for them. Saying we are going to the mattress sounds like, well, it sounds like you only have the one mattress. And like you didn't really watch The Godfather, which means you'll soon be sleeping with the fishes. The runner-up, worser, Speaker Mike Johnson. Just when you thought he might not be a total Trump whore, he stood on the site of January 6th in front of scumbags like Cleta Mitchell and Stephen Miller, and I think there was one person in the pink pantsuit in the back there who was Beetlejuice. And Johnson explained why the House wants to make it illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, given that, it already is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Ugly little Johnson said with an actual smirk and laugh, we all know, intuitively, that a lot of illegals are voting in federal elections, but it's not been something that's easily provable. We don't have that number, unquote. Actually, we do have that number. And we all know intuitively that Republicans foster this distrust in reality and law so they can blame their losses on imaginary threats like massive illegal voting, when time and time again the only people even accused of illegally voting turn out to be Republicans. And by the way, Mike, about your election to the House, you won by less than 41,000 votes. We all know intuitively that even the people of Louisiana aren't that stupid to have elected a slick, slimy homophobe who we all know intuitively seems to protest a little too much. So we all know intuitively that election must have featured some illegal voting. What was that number, Mike? We don't have that intuitively, do we? Oh, and congratulations on surviving the latest attempt by your own party to fire you, to vacate the chair yesterday. Why, when the Republicans do this, do I always think of vacate in its gastrointestinal sense? But our winner, the worst, why? It's Mike Johnson's fellow Republican Congressman Mike Collins of Georgia. Last week, he tweeted out a video of the racist student at the University of Mississippi making monkey gestures at a protester who happened to be an African-American woman. He put a RT on it that read something like, "Ole Miss doing the job, getting the job done." Well, that's when some of his donors, like a little company called Coca-Cola, began to take heat and give heat about Collins's endorsement of, overt 1958-style racism on tape. Well, Mike Collins of this week saw Mike Collins of last week and said, "Hold my racist beer." Yesterday afternoon, long after the RFK Jr. brainworm story had spread nationally, Mike Collins returned to Twitter X and wrote, quote, "You either die a Kennedy with a hole in the brain or live long enough to become a Kennedy with a hole in the brain." As I said earlier, RFK Jr.'s worm is fair game. He brought it up, and he brought it up so he didn't have to pay a lot of alimony. But to turn it into a joke about the assassination of President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy, both shot through the brain in not just two of the most traumatic events in American history, but two of its goriest, this shows that this scumbag, Mike Collins, has somehow managed to dishonor both the House Freedom Caucus and his family ancestral home of Butts County, Georgia. Congressman Mike Collins. Hey, Mike, you've lucked out here. You don't even have a brain we can make jokes about. Today's worst person in the world! Now to the number one story on the countdown and my favorite topic, me and things I promised not to tell. Early on the afternoon of Monday, May 23rd, 2016, I bounced out of my New York City apartment building, began to walk past the tourist trap brunch spot in the lobby, and froze. There, at one of the cramped outdoor tables, staring up at me in blank surprise that must have matched my own staring down at him in blank surprise, was Lawrence O'Donnell. I decided to go silly. "Hey, get out of my house." He laughed. I laughed. It didn't seem forced. He introduced me to his companion, his daughter. "This, my dear, is Keith Olbermann. Keith started us all at MSNBC, and then he left, and here Lawrence gave one of his long pauses, and we crashed it." I wanted to be generous. I started to politely contradict him, and I just couldn't do it. Yeah, pretty much. Anyway, about 30 seconds of courteous nothingness followed, and I wished the O'Donnells well, and then I left. It was the most pleasant experience I ever had with Lawrence O'Donnell. In fact, it might have been the only pleasant experience I ever had with Lawrence O'Donnell. After I finally convinced and bullied and blackmailed MSNBC management into letting Rachel Maddow become the regular guest host for my show, and she aced it, and then rightly got her own show, and she aced that and became a star, I went looking for a new guest host. My first idea was a frequent guest we had named Chris Hayes. I didn't get far. Management had its own idea, and my input was not required. They wanted former Vermont governor and Democratic presidential hopeful Howard Dean. And Howard is a really smart guy and great on TV, but Howard had a bit of a teleprompter problem. One of my producers swears that Howard once read, "Good evening, I'm Howard. Dean, former governor of Vermont, this is Countdown." I do know whatever he did on the air, it was bad enough that one week, when I was off and at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, and a baseball news story broke and he was filling in for me, my producers called me there and asked me to come on from the streets of Cooperstown and be a guest on my own show just to help Howard Dean out. Anyway, their next idea was a guy who had been kicking around MSNBC since its founding in 1996. Lawrence O'Donnell was one of the original MSNBC friends. The MSNBC friends. Political pundits who sat on clear stools at a clear table or in a set designed to look like a booth at a coffee shop. No, I'm not making this up. Among the friends were Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham, if you can believe it. Once or twice an hour, the rather CNN-like all-news coverage on MSNBC in its first couple of years would pause, and 3 or more of these friends would appear, chew over the MSNBC headlines, and then disappear. Lawrence O'Donnell was one of the friends. It was as bad as it sounds. Then Lawrence O'Donnell pretty much disappeared. You would see him on MSNBC as a guest every once in a while, but mostly he pursued his acting and producing career. He played President Bartlett's father on The West Wing, the one who beat him throughout college. Lawrence was very convincing. And then around 2008, we started getting pressure to bring him in as a guest on Countdown, like once a week or twice a week. I was not sure what that was all about, but he had been a Senate staffer, and he knew the healthcare debate and other wonky stuff pretty well, so I gave my assent for whatever that was worth. Not long after that, Lawrence came into my office. He really needed my support, he said, to get him more involved in MSNBC. He knew I had gone to bat for Rachel, and before her, I'd gone to bat for Tom Brokaw, and for people like Chuck Todd and Chris Hayes and others who are now getting steady incomes from NBC. I don't remember his argument on his own behalf. I do remember I didn't have much of a reason to say no, and he wasn't asking me to do a lot, so I said yes. The next thing I knew, I was reading a memo announcing that Lawrence O'Donnell had been appointed as the new full-time guest host of Countdown. This was in the winter of 2009-2010, when my late dad was fighting so valiantly to stay alive after colon cancer and, more importantly, a series of infections. Dad had the immune system of an alien. The average white cell count in a healthy adult is between 4,000 and 11,000. One night, Dad's was at 33,000. And the doctors told me to prepare to make the call to let him go. They had one antibiotic left to try on him. The next morning, Dad's white cell count, which had been 33,000, was 8,000. Onward he fought. Unfortunately, he was 80 years old, and he had not exercised since Harry Truman was president, and eventually he ran out of Houdini tricks. I had been visiting him twice a day for 6 months while still doing Countdown and the NBC Sunday Night Football show, but now, as it hit late February of 2010, his bright days became fewer and farther in between, and the hope that was propelling me to keep being his full-time caregiver and Countdown's full-time host both began to fade. In the last 2 weeks of my dad's life, as the doctors tried all the long-shot things, I asked MSNBC for a leave of absence. Finally, the inevitability became inarguable, and we let Dad go on Saturday, March 13th, 2010. My sister held his hand, and I read him his favorite Thurber story, and as soon as I finished it, he exhaled deeply and peacefully, and he died. I think I took another week off, maybe 2, and I vaguely recall emails from friends at Countdown that I may have paid passing attention to, but I really didn't. Most of the staff, including people who came up from Washington, like Howard Feynman or Gene Robinson of the Washington Post, always friends to me. They attended my dad's memorial service. I believe Lawrence O'Donnell, who was, of course, filling in for me on Countdown, was there too, but maybe not. I do not remember. And then came the day when I went back to the office full-time and my assistant grabbed me. Both hands on my wrist. "You did not answer my emails," she said with a fervency she rarely exhibited. "For God's sake, do not ever leave me alone with Lawrence O'Donnell again." I snapped back to attention. Had he, bothered her? "Not that way," she said, "but he's a son of a bitch. He treats me and everybody who isn't a producer here like dirt. And since you didn't read my emails, I just have to tell you this. He's trying to get you fired so he can take over Countdown. And if you think he's nuts, one of your senior producers is in on it too, with him. I have to admit, even now, of all the things I went through at that very, very strange place, MSNBC, even now, this story still shocks me. The senior producers of Countdown consisted of a guy who'd been a producer who booked satellite transmissions for MSNBC until I asked that he be promoted. And one was a guest booker for the daytime shows until I asked that she be promoted. Another was a line producer who was well regarded only for his ability to time a show until I asked for him to be promoted. And then there was the old friend of mine who had been blown out of ESPN in a sexual harassment porn link email scandal and was headed back to college to start his career all over again until I asked that he be hired and then promoted. I did some digging, and I was going to confront O'Donnell about it when somebody told me he had tweeted something negative about me and about Countdown. So I got a hold of him, and I said this did not seem to be in keeping with MSNBC traditions and rules, you know, the ones about not peeing inside the tent. And he said, what do you know about MSNBC traditions? I've been here since 1996. I never left and came back. So I went to my boss, the president of the network, Phil Griffin, the one who would not hire Rachel Maddow. And before I could say they'd have to get rid of him, Griffin said it was all academic. They were preparing the press release as we spoke for Lawrence's new show at 10 o'clock called The Last Word. And oh, by the way, Keith, 2 of your senior producers are going with him to run his show. If this sounds vaguely familiar to you, it is the plot of the pilot for the old Aaron Sorkin HBO series Newsroom. I was still friendly with Aaron then, so he actually asked, as I related this to him in real time in emails and phone calls, he asked if he could use it in the plot rather than just what he often did, which was to use it without asking. The problem was, none of this made any sense in the real world, although it made a pretty good pilot for Aaron Sorkin. In going into the 10 p.m. slot, Lawrence O'Donnell would be replacing a rerun of Countdown. And even if O'Donnell did much better in the ratings, much better, there was no way it could ever make enough money to make the move make sense. O'Donnell's new show would necessarily cost MSNBC between $10 and $15 million to produce every year. Didn't have anything to do with him. That was the cost. The Countdown rerun cost not $10, $15 million a year. It count however much they paid the guy who pushed the play button that fired up the videotape of the Countdown replay, amortized. Later that day, a sympathetic NBC executive called me up and explained the move to me. First, Griffin was convinced O'Donnell was about to leave us and sign with CNN. I said, well, that's a good idea for everybody involved except CNN. Turned out CNN had not even talked to him, but Griffin did not know that. More importantly, Comcast had already finalized its agreement to buy NBC effective the following January. And as part of the deal, they were entitled to review what all the executives in the company had done, and they had already looked at MSNBC President Phil Griffin and discovered he had never done anything. In panic, Griffin told colleagues he had to launch a new show of his own immediately. This is the series Aaron Sorkin should have made. As to the producers who left my show to go with O'Donnell while my father was dying, one of them told me a couple of years after she left MSNBC for the last time, every day when I went into that last word office, I realized you were getting your revenge on me without even having to lift a finger. Lots of people I've worked with, probably a majority of people I've helped, have behaved like Lawrence O'Donnell because, remember, it's television. It is a mental illness. The comparatively healthy people are the ones who acknowledge it's a mental illness. But Lawrence O'Donnell was something special. A year before my dad died, almost to the day, in fact, I was in Los Angeles appearing on Bill Maher's show. And one of the other guests that night was the actress Kerry Washington. She was very nice to me, very sweet, a very big fan. And she asked to stay in touch. Sure enough, after my father died, after the memorial, after I was back at work, I had to go to his house for the first time since he had passed away. It was about as much fun as it sounds. In the car on the way back into New York City, the solemnity of it. Both my parents died within 11 months of each other. It really hit me for some reason for the first time full force. And I was about to lose it when the car approached a billboard overlooking the West Side Highway in New York City. And whose big smiling face was on the ad on that billboard? Kerry Washington. And it flashed me right back to her kindness in L.A., and it helped me overcome this bump in my morning. So I wanted to drop her a note. Nothing big. Nothing suggestive. I wasn't hinting at asking her out. Just, you never know how you might help somebody in a time of crisis. Thanks for letting me smile. That was the whole message. I asked my assistant to figure out how to get it to her, and that was the end of it. Except, a week later, the fact that I wrote her a note wound up in a column written by Ann Coulter. I was astonished. How? Why? Ann Coulter? It was her usual, the brain doesn't quite work right kind of stuff. She implied I was hitting on Kerry Washington and said how stupid I had to be to not realize she was involved with somebody, and on and on and on. No mention of my father's passing or the Mars show or the billboard or her smiling face. I went back to my assistant and I said, hey, what on earth did you do with that note to Kerry Washington? And she said, oh, I gave it to this Lawrence O'Donnell guy. And I said, good God, why did you do that? And she said, well, he's dating Kerry Washington. I thought you knew that. I thought that's why you asked me to get it to her. So it wasn't hard to figure out from there. Lawrence had called his old friend from the old MSNBC Friends of 1996, Ann Coulter, and told her about the note, inventing whatever motive his jealous little mind could dream up. It should have gotten him fired from NBC, but unfortunately his boss was just as much of a 14-year-old emotionally as he was. And meanwhile, I had decided to get out of MSNBC anyway when the time was ripe. As it turned out, it ripened in January of 2011. I've told that story in other episodes, like 60 of them. It's kind of complicated. And since nobody ever actually asked me why Countdown, the TV show, ended, I've probably got another 60 episodes worth of information about that. Anyway, in 2015, since repeatedly over the following 10 years there were overtures by both sides to bring Countdown and me back to MSNBC, in 2015, during the World Series, in fact, the then president of NBC News, Andy Lack, asked me to come back and do a new show at MSNBC and move to Los Angeles and have a co-host, a conservative, and not do any commentaries. And actually this new show is somehow less appealing than it sounds. But the punchline of all punchlines is contained in what Lack wanted to call my new 2015 MSNBC show that never was. It tells you all you really need to know about the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell and MSNBC and O'Donnell's place in TV history and its demise and the end of MSNBC. NBC News President Lack was brimming with enthusiasm about this name that he had come up with for my new show. I've got the perfect title, Lack told me. We're going to call it The Last Word with Keith Olbermann. And I didn't laugh or guffaw. I just said, Andy, you have a show called The Last Word. The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Andy Lack now laughed. Huh, hopefully not for much longer, I don't. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers and not by Aaron Sorkin. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Kenny Mayne. Everything else was pretty much my fault. And later it will be Aaron Sorkin's. That's Countdown for this, the 181st day until the 2024 presidential election. and the 1,220th day since dictator J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the justice system, use the mental health system, use the not regularly given elector objection option, use, if it happens, presidential immunity to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news warrants. Until then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.